Hey everyone, today I'm joined by Andrés Gómez Emilsson. Andres is aware of many hats. He's the director of research at Qualia Research Institute. Also, I believe the founder, but certainly the moderator and the sort of uh, principal contributor to the content that gets posted at Qualia Computing Networking Facebook group, which I've been deeply fascinated by, and that's actually kind of my foray or entry point into some of this stuff. But as I've kind of gotten drawn in, I've just been deeply fascinated by it. I'd also just say, I mean, you're just a brilliant human being, and you exude a wonderful lightness and exuberance. And yeah, I really wanted to talk to you about a couple of things as I've been diving into some of the stuff that you've been doing and some of the work. I think there's so many areas that we could explore, and there's a lot of different angles, points of entry here. But the one that I thought might be the most compelling up front, anyway, is to consider what you talk about as the consciousness versus pure replicators idea. So
Yeah,
I figured we could get into some of that. But yeah, I don't know. Just first off, welcome. Thank you so much for being here, and I'm looking forward to exploring some of these topics with you.
it's thank you so much for inviting me. And I mean, you've been having some amazing guests. Obviously Roger Teasdale is in the sphere, and I'm just like so happy that like the community is kind of like shaping up, and also that like we can actually talk about things like, fourth path, classical enlightenment with like a normal dude who's like 26 years old rather than like, some esoteric, like, yeah,
For
anyway.
sure, for sure. Yes, I discovered Roger through the sort of network, and obviously he's been on a couple times, and agreed. Such a brilliant, wonderful, insightful human being. I also forgot to mention too that you've had a couple Stoa appearances, so it's just interesting, as you say, like there's just a lot of overlap and synergy between a lot of the communities of people thinking at certain levels, and it's really exciting to see all the different kind of cross pollinations going on. So let's dive into it. There's a particular video that you posted that I'll link to, and it's called A Universal Plot: Consciousness versus Pure Replicators, Gene Servants or Blissful Autopoetic Beings. And there's an associated, I guess you call it a blog post, but it's on the qualiacomputing.com sort of list of posts in the archive section, called, well, a similar name, The Universal Plot, Part 1, Consciousness, which is Pure Replicators. And I wanted to explore some of this terrain. So first, I don't want to linger too long on this because I just recommend that people go watch the video and read the article and stuff. And otherwise, I want to use this time to sort of dig into some of the meatier parts. But maybe just as a basic kind of groundwork, do you want to sort of summarize that in like 3 to 5 minutes or
Of
something?
course,
Yeah.
of course, yeah. So I think, I mean, that's my the way in which I think of kind of like ethics and like what is it that we're doing here? What are the opportunities, and what are the kind of like what kind of like what is it the thing that might seduce us into a pretty bad outcome? And I think like okay, so broadly speaking, I kind of like categorized like four, kind of like conceptual revolutions for how to understand like ethics. Like, okay, like naively, we all start with kind of like a conception of the good as, good versus evil. And obviously there are some religions and philosophies that really kind of like want to emphasize that. Obviously also political perspectives and like even kind of like narratives, kind of like children's stories, good versus evil is like all over the place. But then you've got to ask, okay, like, but what is the incentive actually of somebody who's evil? Like, what is behind the mask, and like what is going on there? And obviously, okay, like, um, a Buddhist might tell you like, okay, this is just kind of the result of a lot of like causes and conditions, and conditioned existence. And actually, like deep down, there's nobody like truly evil in kind of like a metaphysical fundamental way. Is in some sense you could say is kind of like people are like unskillful, and like unskillfulness kind of like builds up into like patterns of conditioning and ego constructs that, yeah, they kind of snowball into like really terrible things. But ultimately, yeah, it's not like there's like this evil essence out there. So that's kind of like an important step, and a lot of people then kind of transition to this idea of the balance between good and evil, which is one way of kind of like trying to resolve this, trying to feel good about reality and think, okay, like how do I account for all of these terrible things that happen? And yeah, I mean, if you see kind of like a lot of people, displaying the yin yang as kind of like their most spiritual symbol, is like, yeah, there's like light and shadow, there's like pain and pleasure. They come together. Alan Watts is like, a big proponent of that. Is like, yeah, like, yes, the terrible things happen, but that's just kind of like part of the deal. Dualities are inherent to existence and things like that. But I will point out that when somebody is like really into like the good and evil balance between good and evil perspective, they might even say things such as like, everything is already perfect, as it is. And like, this is just kind of how perfection manifests or something like that. Well, very ironically, like the reason why they believe this is because that's a mood boosting kind of thought. Like they don't know it, but they're actually trying to reduce suffering in their own mind, in their own cognition, by believing this. And in some sense, that's almost kind of like a straight, counter example to like the very premise of this is, well, yes, if you're actually like very happy with, like the balance between good and evil, yeah, I mean, people should in a sense like volunteer to be, the ones who are suffering or something like that, because yeah, everything balances out. But yeah, so I do regard it as kind of a developmental stage, not really kind of the truth. It is a little bit better than good versus evil, because at least you're not like as like neurotic and afraid and in a sense like reactive towards like things you perceive as evil, which yeah cultivates a bit of equanimity and yeah, like other good faculties of the mind. But I think it's still kind of a delusion. It's just not a very skillful way of approaching this. So, okay, the third one is gradients of wisdom. It's just kind of, okay, like let's take this skillful versus unskillful frame and, take it like much further. And, people like Sam Harris, actually, I would say like a lot of intellectuals nowadays are kind of like in this, that we could call it developmental stage. It sounds arrogant. Maybe we could say like, the, conceptual frame or something like that. And essentially in gradients of wisdom, you recognize that, okay, actually there are, ways of arranging human interactions, beliefs, attitudes that are much more conducive to human flourishing than others. And it's not, we don't live in this, beautiful kind of like postmodern ecosystem where like every single philosophy, is equally valid or anything of the sort. Is like, no. Actually, there are things that are like much better for human flourishing than others. And let's not, we shouldn't think about this as like an offensive or like necessarily like an ego-driven observation. Is like, oh, my thing is the better. But rather, like if you develop this openness to like, no, actually, there are ways of, assembling information, assembling attitudes that deliver more flourishing. Yeah, it can be really humbling, and ideally, it's something that actually gives rise to even better ways of thinking. But I would say like it still lacks kind of like a capacity to like solve disagreements in a principled fashion, because like your wisdom may not be the same as my wisdom. Plus, there's kind of like a lot of like intricate problems, such as how do you compare the value of like two different living beings and things like that. So instead, I mean, I think like the thing that I was kind of advocating in that article, in that video, is let's take a kind of like a very philosophically rigorous perspective with like some explicit background assumptions. And some of the background assumptions that I tend to, use as kind of fuel for philosophy are things such as open individualism. So like this idea that actually, like in some very literal sense, we're all one consciousness. And of course, it sounds like very hippie. It sounds very, very spiritual and so on. But there's like just so many good philosophical arguments for things in that neighborhood, even if not like literally that. And many reasons why like our, common sense conception of the self and like continuity of consciousness and so on is also probably wrong. That, okay, like if you have any kind of like decent level of model uncertainty, you should assign some probability to things, so, you know, in the ballpark of open individualism, that we're all one. When you get there, you know, it starts to kind of like become pretty clear that, okay, like if we're all one, you will kind of have to live through every lifetime and, you know, every point of view. So in some sense, that automatically already gives you kind of a utilitarian perspective in that way. It's kind of utilitarianism plus like deep compassion, because you will actually have to yourself go through every single one of the possibilities. And if you combine that with rationality, it's like, okay, like you are everybody. And also, let's be rational about it. Let's not just, you know, fantasize or, you know, create a romanticize it. It's like, no, let's assume that's like kind of like literal. And then like, what do you do? I mean, it's the right. It's like if you know you're going to be hit in the head with a bat tomorrow, you probably want to plan for that. You know, if you know there's going to be, you know, a lot of factory farming next year, let's plan for that, because you also have, you know, you will experience that from a certain perspective. And another important kind of element of these philosophical background assumptions is valence realism. This idea that deep down, the thing that determines value from a moment-to-moment basis is how good or bad experience feels. And this is usually thought of as a very shallow perspective, like, you know, hedonism. People bring up like, oh, but what about meaning? You know, what about community? What about these other things that are not necessarily pleasant, but we consider very valuable? From our perspective, essentially, all of those things are still based on valence. It's just that valence, like how good or bad experiences feel, is a much, much, much broader, you know, set of phenomena than just, you know, bodily pleasure. You could also have like positive or negative feelings of meaning. And in that sense, yeah, that's also, you know, within valence. And in that sense, yeah, I don't think you can really escape that. So once you combine kind of these like rigorous philosophical background assumptions, I think you arrive at essentially this new way of thinking, which is consciousness versus replicators. Like the real, like, you know, the real plot, the real kind of like meaty stuff that is happening in this universe, the juicy stuff, is how patterns convince, you know, consciousness that that consciousness is something that it isn't. You know, that, you know, I am, you know, the branch manager of, you know, a very, you know, very prestigious New York firm or something. And like, that's what I am fundamentally. Okay, like that would be kind of a possible kind of like replicator angle on these. But there's like just, okay, that was just kind of a funny example. That was like, it happens all over the place and at every scale as well. You know, like replicators can exist at the, you know, microscopic level, like viruses, like or nanotechnology. Replicators also exist at the level of ideas and memes, right? Like if a meme, you know, really makes us identify with it, or it divides society in a particular way, that you may think of that as a unfortunate kind of like replicator dynamic. And it also happens at the level of groups, where essentially you have an entire group, you know, an entire set of people identifying with the group and believing that that's what they are at a fundamental level, right? And they are afraid that if that stops existing, you know, they will stop existing fundamentally, which is, of course, yeah, one of these like tricks that, yes, of course, like groups that manage to convince you that will probably have an evolutionary advantage, which is, yeah, why we see that sort of behavior. But probably at the deepest level, the thing that is going to be the hardest to overcome, I actually think, is like replicators at the level of genes. That essentially a lot of, you know, biology can be understood as through the lens of the selfish gene. I mean, obviously there's a lot of updates and epicycles on that, but I mean, approximately the genes want to make copies of themselves, or want to describe it that way, independently of the well-being of the organisms that carry them, right? So if suffering a ton is still helping your genes propagate, they will do that. I mean, because, okay, for Darwinian reasons. So, and I think like so many of our problems actually come down to that it is, you know, the selfish genes are, you know, they give us, for example, you know, the concept of the shadow, that like we do things without like realizing actually that we are pursuing self-interest, and, you know, we deceive ourselves in all sorts of ways. And all of that, I would, you know, kind of like put it on the category of replicators going in a bad direction. And And yeah, I mean, I think like that's ultimately the plot of the universe. Like you have kind of like two possible paths. I mean, to a first approximation, you have two possible paths for the long-term future. You have either we all get like sucked into replicator dynamics, and let's say, sure, like maybe we become some kind of like cool society, but that still has a bunch of suffering, still has a bunch of problems, and we identify with it, and we truly believe that's what we are at a fundamental level. You know, that we are humanity itself, or that we are, you know, I don't know, the Chinese Communist Party, as an example, whatever it may be. The other path that I see forward is kind of like a liberatory path, where like actually consciousness, the interests of consciousness are the things that win. That we somehow manage to create a critical mass of people who realize, yeah, actually what we are fundamentally is consciousness, not the patterns that consciousness is instantiated. How can we, in a sense, merge replicator dynamics so that they don't go out of control, while in such a way that they give consciousness as much freedom and space and love as possible. So
Yeah.
okay, that's
Perfect.
about it.
Yeah, no, I think that really encapsulates it, hits all the main points. And so one of the things I want to get clarified is what exactly then consciousness is about. If in what you're talking about, consciousness sort of how would I say this? You talk about sort of evolution. I don't want to say developing consciousness as a kind of byproduct, but it's sort of like a kind of happy accident that, as you say, there's sort of there's like a non-trivial amount of information processing dynamic that sort of gets hit on, and sort of like this is evolutionarily advantageous, and so it kind of starts replicating, right? And so what I'm curious about here is trying to parse out the relationship of consciousness itself to replication, right? If consciousness arose via genetic, Darwinian evolution as a sort of it was selected for because it provided certain capacities that gave it an evolutionary edge. I'm trying to clarify a little bit in your way of thinking about this. What then is the relationship of consciousness like to replication? Is there a way that somehow these things are somehow fundamentally separable, or are they inseparable? Do we need replicatory, like genetic material to develop in order to have consciousness, but we just don't want replication to get out of control, that sort of a thing? And maybe one way of clarifying that a little bit could be to go into talking a little bit more about what you mean by open individualism and the idea of sort of this sort of universal consciousness that we're all a part of, because there's sort of the biological assumption, I think, in the sort of reductionist sciences, or the physical science, natural materialistic sciences, that sort of thinks of consciousness as sort of an epiphenomenon, or even an emergent property of genetic material. And so there's sort of a question there too, is like, does consciousness emerge out of replication, or is it sort of a background reality that, so speak to some of those ideas.
Totally. Yeah, I think consciousness is a background reality, kind of independent of replication. I mean, in some sense, replication is completely unavoidable because of this concept called universal Darwinism. And like, I mean, essentially, even if you look at, quantum systems at the absolutely, lowest level, some people actually argue that the way to understand them is like as evolutionary processes themselves, that essentially this is a rabbit hole, but like essentially that like, the information that we get of our environment, even if it's at the quantum level, is not necessarily what the environment is about, but is rather the information that is good at replicating. And that is like the actual things that we sense. So in some sense, replication is completely unavoidable. But I would say in some other conceptual ways, they're like clearly separable. So here's the overall picture. So I don't, in our view, in our worldview, essentially consciousness is not like the result of information processing. That is, there's like a lot of perspectives that see that. Definitely, the whole category of functionalism, computational theory of consciousness, and so on. And I used to believe that. I mean, like I used to be a very big proponent of that. but eventually, after thinking very deeply about the what's called the phenomenal binding problem, um, which in brief means how is it possible that all of these atoms in your brain simultaneously contribute to a unified experience? Like if you dig very deep into that problem, you will eventually, hopefully, realize that the causal power of consciousness, like the reason consciousness was recruited by natural selection, is because bound experiences can be useful. So the causal structure, in a sense, is not like, okay, information processing gives rise to consciousness. It's more bound experiences have useful properties. And those useful properties have been recruited for information processing or for causal effects in organisms. So in a sense, those bound experiences could exist on their own. You could create them in a lab potentially. They don't need to be part of a self-replicating system. And like by and large, like if you sample from the state space of consciousness, like okay, like a bound experience roughly the size of a experience of a human, overwhelmingly they're not going to be interested in replicating, because that's just like kind of like hitting the jackpot in like, okay, this one configuration actually is interested in replicating. Overwhelmingly the vast majority of like configurations are going to be just like weird things with like very weird interests or no interests at all. I mean, like probably most of them kind of like completely happy to just be whatever they are, independent of that. And now the claim, furthermore, is that we think that what we want is to replicate in a way, but in some sense, I would claim that that is evolution has kind of like shaped us into particularly weird and uncomfortable configurations that makes the relieving of our suffering conditional on replicating. So, and I mean, think of it this like quite literally, that like when you have a desire, like when you have an intention, a craving, or a hatred or whatnot, um, that happens within our world simulation. I mean, it happens within representations of the environment, of other people, of ideas, and so on. Um, and so, like, when you're very afraid of something, you want to kind of like get away from that. And you may think that, you're kind of like that truly your desire here, like what you're truly doing is like trying to get physically away from that. But actually, what is going on in the mind is like you have this kind of uncomfortable configuration that you're trying to relieve. And the way to relieve it will involve oftentimes kind of like external actions. But of course, you could relieve it in other ways. I mean, like with meditation or with drugs, you could kind of like undo that unpleasant configuration that is like making you do things. And this is a concept we call the tyranny of the intentional object, which is this idea that we believe, that it is the semantic content, that is the external things that makes us happy or unhappy. But deep down, actually, the thing that is making us happy or unhappy is the configuration of our experience. That like, if you introspect on like, what is a craving, like fundamentally, what is a craving, you will realize it is like this weird pattern of tension in your energy body that is entangled or is like connected with semantic content, such that like when you, let's say, finally buy the car or whatever, your feeling of craving gets relieved. But like that was like there all along. Like actually the thing that you truly like were trying to relieve was like this uncomfortable tense pattern. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. Though it raises the question for me, and this is another thing I really wanted to get into, was I think that it's the way of thinking about valence that I'm used to, and I think a lot of us are, is sort of via the evolutionary lens, right? It's sort of like, what is pain and pleasure? What is, the associated, oh, that's good, I'm attracted to that, or that's bad, I'm repulsed from that. Well, it's something that has an evolutionary advantage, which either will basically ultimately lead to my replication or, delete or detract from it, right? So that I look at feces and I'm repulsed. Well, there's evolutionary reasons for that, right? And I see a beautiful naked body of the sort of person I'm attracted to, and I'm attracted, right? It's sort of like, okay, this is evolution making a pleasure pain dynamic out of the very stuff of replication. So what I'm intrigued by then is like, if we're divorcing in some ways, or at least making distinct, differentiating consciousness itself from replication patterns, what's the basis of then understanding the source of valence? Like what is good or bad, for consciousness when you remove it from a replicating body?
Yeah. So this is this philosophy. We're very bullish, or in a sense, like we're championing it at the Qualia Research Institute, which is this idea of valence structuralism. That like the thing that makes an experience feel good or bad is its configuration, and like that is what consciousness is actually interested in. Like we don't want to be in uncomfortable configurations, and so evolution, is recruiting that, is like connecting, semantic information to make us do things by attaching it with like unpleasant or pleasant configurations of experience. I mean, this is something like once you kind of like learn to notice it, it becomes like super apparent. Like, for example, you believe you want a chocolate cake, but okay, like what happens when you actually eat the chocolate cake? Okay, you actually have like pleasurable sensations in your mouth, but even more so, you also will have kind of these pleasant harmonic waves across your body. And like, that was the thing that you wanted all along, not the chocolate cake. Or like, you believe you want, I mean, I guess this is, let's say like you believe you want a promotion or something like that. But actually what you want is like the sense of relief and security that comes after getting it. So there's like a lot of tricks like that like our mind believes it wants something that has to do with replication, but actually deep down the thing that it's pursuing is like better configurations that are less dissonant and less asymmetrical. So yeah.
Well, so then, okay, this is really interesting too, because I wanted to ask you about this too. So then how do we understand evolutionary replication as potentially serving that end, right? Is it because arguably, or the way that I interpret some of this, it can sound a little bit sort of like consciousness versus replication, which you could almost say is sort of like consciousness versus, organic evolution in some ways. But I almost want to see that more as like, is there a harmonious pairing here? Because I mean, look, I mean, consciousness, as you say, itself became recruited by means of the evolutionary process. So I'm attracted to the idea of to what degree is evolution itself leading us to more harmonious configurations. What's your thought on that?
Oh, totally. I mean, like the Darwinian engine, like is if anything, is a thing that can bootstrap essentially like beautiful paradises and full spectrum super intelligences and like all of the really really good stuff that can exist in reality. That's true. That's true. That said, I mean, I'm often like wary of kind of romanticizing it, and like Darwinian, the Darwinian engine is also an engine of tremendous suffering. Like it is like just such a incredibly massive, like source of like horrifying things. And in that, like that's kind of like why I'm not, I don't romanticize it. Like I kind of think of it as like, okay, like now that we are where we are, like yes, awesome. Let's take advantage of these. We can be grateful for like the evolutionary process for taking us to this place where we are self-aware and we have the capacity to realize that what we care about is actually states of consciousness. But we also have to understand that like that kind of has a momentum of its own, and it, if its path is not in a sense like corrected or controlled by kind of this deeper self-awareness, we risk essentially, just kind of getting sucked into believing that we are like our genes or we are our patterns or something else that might not, lead to a good outcome. But
So then one of the questions for me too then is so I like that a lot. That resonates. It's like we don't need to affirm, like we can look at what the lion and the gazelle are up to and be like, yes, this led to the beauty and the incredible facility and utility of design of both of these species to do what they do, and it led to us being what we are and our sort of recruiting of consciousness. But now that we have that, we can we don't have to then just look to that as being what solves everything, right? Because there's a temptation I think this really kind of came into the fore in the 19th century, in the Victorian age, when kind of people more or less, did embrace evolution. And, you had Tennyson saying, well, nature red in tooth and claw, and that sort of a thing. And it was very scandalizing, right? And there was sort of like, well, do we just fully adopt this and lead to this sort of social Darwinistic thing, right, or whatever? And then, of course, you get eugenics and all this sort of stuff. Or is there some way? And I think that that's been a tension that's been playing out for a long time. And I think some of this can kind of help resolve that. And a lot of the stuff that I see evolving in this metamodern meta narrative finds ways of appropriately relating these different dynamics in sort of a stack where you can appreciate what has been, but that doesn't mean we need to then say, like past doesn't need to be, or prologue, what do you say, past is prologue, but prologue doesn't need to be, there's an expression there that isn't coming to mind, but you get it. Prologue doesn't need to be future. But then another really interesting issue comes up for me too, right, which is that maybe you'll disentangle some of my assumptions here, which can resolve this, but it would seem that there's a need to at least maintain our material bodies and replication for the sake of there being human organisms and that sort of a thing, right? So that consciousness as perceived by human organisms can continue and perpetuate and continue to develop. So what's sort of the relationship then between, it's not an antagonistic one, right? It needs to be integrative of sort of accepting the replication logic while also, and not like the danger here would be like you get lost in consciousness and then that becomes everything. And then your sort of substrate, because it's no longer being sort of tended to at its biological necessity level, sort of breaks down, but then you lose all the stuff above it, if that makes sense. Unless, and here I guess maybe this is the question, is the consciousness, is that emerging out of the substrate of our biological replicating bodies, or is that a good way of thinking about it, or is there a way that, okay, so I don't know if you understand the basic kind of contours of that question.
Totally, I think so. So first of all, I think like bound experience, essentially like the sort of experiences that we are having right now with rich colors and tactile sensations and thought and emotion, all of that. Yeah, you do need a substrate. I think like, like the human brain, I think that's actually where it's happening. We are physicalists at QRI. It's just that we think that the fire that breathes life into the equations of physics is qualia. So like everything is conscious, in a trivial way, because consciousness is all that exists. And in some regions of that massive web of consciousness, it assembles in such a way that it creates the sort of experiences that we have. But everything around you would be conscious. This is a version of panpsychism. The caveat, though, is that it's overwhelmingly what we might describe as mind dust, and it's not intelligent and it's not self-aware. It's kind of like this weird dream that doesn't have a beginning or doesn't have an end. It doesn't even need to represent a sense of time. I'm sure, like, if we were to actually know, like, okay, what is the experience of superfluid helium or something like that, we would be, very stunned and surprised. It's probably extremely weird, but I suspect it's still qualia. So, in that sense, like, even if we die, like, that's not the end of consciousness. But all of that consciousness around us is not in any way being selected for like positive valence. So and my suspicion is that it's probably like overwhelmingly neutral. So like it's neither good nor bad, it just is around us, that like most of the things that actually do involve kind of a sense of goodness or badness is essentially things that have been like recruited by natural selection to kind of like motivate the organism to act. Now, to your point about like, should we think of this as an antagonistic thing? I would say conceptually, yes. Emotionally, no. So conceptually, yes, because we actually have to be kind of like clear about like what the threat is, what the danger is. And the truth is that, there is a lot of danger, and replicator dynamics are extremely seductive. And like, it's one of those things that like, they can become like anti-fragile. And I do seriously believe, we are like in a relatively small window of time where like consciousness actually has a fighting chance to kind of like become liberated. And I mean, if I were to kind of intuit, there's probably like many other timelines, many other universes where replicator dynamics just like won completely, like even though there was a window of opportunity, and potentially like some of the absolutely worst things that could happen is if suffering turns out to be like very computationally efficient for whatever reason, and then like some large replicator uses suffering for the sake of maintaining its power. And that seems like quite plausible. I mean, like it's there are elements that suggest like, you know, that could be a viable strategy. So that's the sort of things that, yeah, we absolutely 100% need to like avoid somehow. But it is also absolutely the case that like, yeah, I mean, like the hippies and people who are like just really, really, really like kind of like, yeah, peace and love and so on, they won't, you know, make a long lasting impact in the world. Like if you are in team consciousness, but you're refusing to, you know, give credit to the good things in replicator dynamics, if you refuse to look at it, yeah, I mean, like they will take over by default anyway. So in some sense, yes, we need to take, you know, the best elements from everything to the extent that it's possible. But yeah, I mean, I think ultimately what we will want is like something that is like robust, something that doesn't decay, something that self-repairs, but that its purpose, like the whole reason of being for it, is to create good experiences.
Yeah, you can almost think of like addiction as a negative feedback loop based on suffering in some ways.
Oh, yeah.
And it's very possible to kind of, unfortunately, it's not in any way too difficult to conceive of the future in which you just sort of have a runaway addictive, you know, process that then defines everything. But gosh, there's so many interesting avenues that this could go down. The first one, because I definitely want to touch on it, I want to explore it a little bit, is that you frame this also as leading to, you know, you call it sort of engineering paradise, right? Or leading to the capacity to, if we can properly formulate our understanding of consciousness and valence and positive qualia, like in the right way, we can then be intentional about basically framing the future along those lines. And that then leads to the question of, yeah, I guess sort of like, where is it all going, right? As you say, there's sort of the possibility that this could all just kind of go into an avenue, kind of hellish direction where replication for its own sake is sort of prioritized, and the cost or the effects on consciousness is, you know, just you know, not considered at the very least. And maybe even in worst case scenarios, you say like actual deleterious bad negative qualia are replication, a kind of positive replicating feedback loop, which would be hell, I guess, really. And so the alternative to that is sort of heaven, which is how can we get a positive feedback loop, or a how can we help, yeah, to engineer with this understanding a future which is, you know, more in line with sort of the 5-MeO DMT, you know, paradise consciousness state, or more than the hellish one. And I guess to frame that as a question, I'm curious because some of the things that have come up in sort of the other conversations I've had with people about talking about narratives, metamodern meta narratives, this sort of thing. If there is a sort of evolutionary track that's underway, and it doesn't necessarily need to be teleological. In fact, a lot of people adamantly say it's not teleological, it's not predetermined, it's not right. But if there is something that's sort of leading us towards a kind of greater complexification and this sort of thing, maybe some kind of a mega point or whatever, if you kind of use that terminology. Greg Enriquez talks about a fifth joint point in complexity, where, yeah, now something new is added into the mix. There's a new emergent sort of, whether it's an information processing system or something, where our future is now, it's based on these material substrates, but it's also open to all these new possibilities. And you know, a lot of people are thinking in terms of, well, is this artificial reality or augmented reality, virtual reality that's starting to come online? I guess the question would be like, when you think about this sort of engineering paradise endeavor, is this a technological endeavor? Is this sort of a is this something that you could see happening by means of our technological insight and capacity, or is this something more biologically and organic and internal? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so like, is there a teleology here? I mean, in some sense, yes.
Well, and I don't
So
even, it doesn't even, the crux of the question doesn't have to be the
yeah,
teleology part, just the
yeah.
question of what, like in practice, do you see this engineering of paradise really looking like? Could you give an
Oh, sure.
example of like, is this something we'll be putting on headsets, or we'll be, having a, IV drip or something? Like, is it using sort of the mechanism of our material bodies? Is it some kind of eugenic engineering of a superhuman, right? What does the engineering of paradise look like then, once we start thinking about consciousness as being what it's all about?
Yeah, I mean, I could launch into my 10-point plan for paradise, and I'd be happy to do that. Uh, but I mean, okay, like maybe the most value add response I think would be to clarify that yeah, I mean, like, okay, like transhumanism has a really bad rap, like, and a lot of people, when you mention transhumanism, immediately the thing they think of is, wow, there's like a bunch of ego-driven, guys who just, love them, like are narcissistic, and they want to be feel powerful and like feel superhuman and above everybody else, and like once you meet, for example, David Pierce, you realize like that picture of transhumanism, at least in some cases, is completely wrong. Like you can actually be a transhumanist driven out of compassion, not driven out of ego or driven out of like trying to be superior in any way. Um, if you are willing to face the true causes of suffering, and the true causes of suffering ultimately are evolutionary and genetic. And like I think that it's yeah, something that most people will be in denial about. Well, most people will probably not have enough information to kind of like judge that, but those who do will be in denial about it for a number of reasons. But yeah, to kind of go there, like one, okay, like people are also very afraid of kind of like gene modification from the point of view of okay, like hubris and arrogance and so on, or like messing with kind of like our identities or non-consensual and etc. There's like a lot of arguments of that sort. I would mention that if you take a Buddhist perspective, there's actually no essence to who you are, right? Like if you had been born with like one gene different, it doesn't mean like it would have been a different person. I mean, conventionally, yes, but it's actually all a gradient, right? Like, and throughout your life, you are like many different persons. You're like many different types of experience, and like the difference between those and let's say who you would be if you had like a gene that was like slightly different, there will be like overlap. So like in some sense, like the question of like is this the same person or not is actually um, assumes kind of like a hard boundary, and actually there are no hard boundaries between like peoples and personalities and modes of being, which is really crazy. It goes counter to our intuition, but yeah, there's no hard boundaries. I mean, there's a there is a way of like slowly transforming, let's say, my biology such that eventually I converge towards your biology, and at what point I became you, there's not going to be a hard boundary. It's actually a gradient. So in that sense, like modifying genes, I think like is not as like scary as people might think, because you're not like messing with like a fundamental ontological identity. You're just kind of like messing with a gradient a little bit. And another important perspective is, I mean, people say like, well, that's like reckless, genetic experimentation. Of course, you could do reckless genetic experimentation. That is definitely not anything I would advocate. What I will say though is that nowadays having a child, a completely natural child, is a reckless genetic experiment. I mean, we're talking about, your child has like 1 in 1,000 chance of having cluster headaches. It has like 1 in 10 chance of developing kidney stones, 1 in 5 chance of developing, chronic depression, chronic pain, etc. Like so many things are like gene driven, like just so many things. And it's very strange to say like, yes, I identify with who I am at every level, but I still want my cystic fibrosis cured. Whereas, like, why not say like, well, let's get rid of the genes that are giving rise to the cystic fibrosis. It's not gonna make you, it's not gonna destroy who you are. It's just gonna slightly shift the gradient.
Yeah.
Probably because like this idea that you were somebody completely separate and unique like was wrong to begin with at a fundamental physical level. That said, okay, like genetic solutions are kind of like down the line. I'm sure they will probably be the most important of all. Like David Pierce has like this beautiful line about how we imagine transhuman futures of like people taking a lot of drugs and like being super finely tuned, but in a sense, like if your genes by nature are making you super happy, like taking a drug would actually just disrupt that perfect attractor. So like I do actually envision a future where you're just so happy by default that like taking any drug is actually immoral because it's going to lower that happiness both in the short and long term. So that is the sort of like feature I would envision as like actually really, really wholesome. It's like you don't even need any drug or anything. You're just naturally perfectly fine. Um, and but yeah, in the short term though, we need essentially kind of a three-pronged approach, I would describe it. So we need, and this is kind of, the three pillars that we advocate at QRI, which is number one, let's get rid of intense suffering. Like that's kind of a huge priority. We just have no idea how bad intense suffering is until you experience it. And it's like, it's so much worse than what people intuitively imagine. And it's like so much more common than what people intuitively imagine. And finally, there's many kinds of extreme suffering that may actually be way easier to prevent than what people realize. I could get into that if you're curious. Second one is we've got to figure out how to improve the baseline of happiness, which has like so many other like downstream like positive effects, from productivity to social harmony. And finally, we've got to study peak experiences, like what makes, not only what makes you wake up in the morning because you have a morning coffee that makes you, cheapy, which is great, but also like what makes you, actually love reality at a much deeper level, which is, the fact that things such as 5-MeO exist or MDMA or, falling in love or ultimately things such as like, big philosophical insights and amazing mind-blowing experiences. So what is that? Like, why do they exist and what is their nature? And can we make more of them in a healthy, sustainable fashion? So I think like with those three approaches, taken to kind of like a mature version, we will probably get something that kind of looks like paradise. I mean, something that doesn't have extreme suffering. Okay, I think that's wonderful. Everybody's kind of like a little bit better on a day-to-day basis, motivated and happy, pro-social. And there's like freely available access to like blissful, divine experiences. Yeah, that to me sounds like pretty paradisiacal.
That's really interesting. Just a couple observations. One is that your vision is very organic. Well, I mean, other people wouldn't necessarily apply that term if you're thinking in terms of like non-GMO sort of organic, right? But like it's not sort of the techno transhumanist vision, right? Of like, we'll all just plug our minds into a supercomputer or whatever, right? Which is so the ways that people see this sort of potential transcendence occurring down the line is different. And so it's interesting just to know where kind of how you potentially see that unfolding. And there's a lot of questions I have there. I mean, I don't want to belabor the point, but I think it's an interesting one that just comes up organically at this point, which is like, is there a concern about one of the concerns about something like CRISPR, right, or these sorts of technologies, if we start really thinking about how can we intentionally alter our own genetic makeup, and how can we sort of become involved intentionally in the evolutionary process, this sort of stuff, right? There's a worry about that hubris of like, well, these things are complex systems with a complexity that the hubris lies precisely in thinking that like a human mind can feel like it understands all the variables enough, right? To be confident to actually change or interrupt the process. And so that does come up for me a little bit here. It's sort of like, what do you say to that potential kind of critique, right?
Oh, 100%. I mean, like, I very much take seriously things like, Chesterton's fence. Like, if there's like something that is, some barrier, something that is fixed, and you don't know what it's doing, yeah, it's probably good, not to mess with it until you know, okay, like what is the function of these? And for sure, like there is a lot of hubris in like thinking, yeah, let's modify our genes and we'll be like everything's gonna be better. No, I mean I think this is gonna be like a very long and like actually like very cautious process. And I would actually kind of be critical of the sort of interventions that we do to ourselves all the time as actually being too extreme. I mean, like in a lot of cases, I might describe like the philosophy and the actual effects of things such as like SSRIs as kind of like being like a big hammer on the serotonin system, where like the stories that we tell to each other about how it works like are probably pretty different than how it actually works, and we downplay essentially all of the side effects that come with it. No, I mean I don't even mean like physical side effects, but yeah, in terms of like how it affects people's psychology and social interactions and all of that. I mean, for sure, there's a very big interventions like that. You have to be obviously very, very cautious. And one kind of like philosophy here, I think it's very important to have kind of an approach to modification that respects kind of like the very, very, very long process of evolution that gave rise to these like very complex systems that we are. At the same time, I don't think it's like as complicated as like something like string theory. And I think like as we develop like better causal understanding of how the body works, how biology works, I mean, I suspect there's going to be like some fairly straightforward interventions that do really drastically improve well-being without having a lot of other like side effects. And so one very promising example is the case of Jo Cameron. She's a 70-year-old, vegan school teacher, like elementary school teacher. And she's like really lovely and like very friendly. By all means, by all lights, a very normal kind of lady, very, very like pleasant to be around. Not psychopathic or anything of the sort, very empathic. And it turns out, she says that she's never suffered in her life. And it's not only a psychological thing. If you ask her how childbirth felt, she says, childbirth felt like a tickle. So essentially like extremely painful things for her are, yes, noticeable, like, okay, I've got to, go to the ER or whatever, but they're not like, earth-shattering, horrible things that are like traumatizing, and like nothing like that happens to her. And genetically, there is the hypothesis, I mean, we don't obviously know, but like what's something really unusual about her genetic makeup is mutation in the FAAH gene, which modulates the breakdown of anandamide, one neurotransmitter, which is like related to the cannabinoid system. But I mean, essentially, it seems that she has a genetic makeup where she can, in a sense, get the benefits of like mild pain as a useful signaling mechanism without the subjective, raw feels of that. And like for people, for example, for families where like chronic pain is a very like common occurrence, trying out like with CRISPR or by whatever mean, like getting that mutation and see if that drastically reduces the probability of developing chronic pain seems to be a pretty reasonable kind of mild intervention, unlikely to have kind of like tremendous downstream side effects and things of the sort. And I mean that is the sort of thing like the entryway for sure. I guess like there's a whole other kind of like chapter having to do with like paradise via exploring consciousness itself and psychonautics and things like that. But in terms of kind of like very no nonsense like pain relief, I'm thinking much more of that kind of like
Sure.
very mild interventions. Yeah.
Well, okay, and then another potential critique that came up for me while exploring some of these thoughts is the idea that you could consider this potentially like within the framework of almost like an updated Gnosticism, if you know what I mean, right? There's sort of, if you go all the way back, right, the Gnostics were sort of very anti-body, anti-desire flesh, very, ascetic, which is of course always been part of many different religious ways of thinking. But there was a sense of, oh, body is bad and this sort of immaterial thing is good, and we kind of need to denigrate the body and aim for the kind of transcendent, as it were. And versions of that, of course, kind of permeate so many different religious impulses, right? Where to the point where it's in the past 100 years, and particularly kind of in post-modernity and the postmodern critiques of a lot of things, it was sort of like, no, we need to get back to the body. We need to, thinkers like Nietzsche and others were like, it's our biological drives which are sort of the source of our intensity in our art and our power and this and that. So I wanted to kind of get your take on that idea. Is there, what would you say to folks who would say, well, this kind of just sounds like Gnosticism 2.0, like anti-sex replication, pro-consciousness, transcendence or something like that?
The key difference perhaps is that I don't think Gnostics would be all that into MDMA states of consciousness. I mean, essentially having actual pleasure, I think it's good. It's just the downstream effects of pursuing pleasure compulsively in our current, embodied condition. That is the problem. I mean, how to say this, right? Is people either, they might be kind of shields and advocates for specific drugs, or they will oftentimes say yeah, no, that's fake or terrible. No, look, my contrarian view here is that the high of methamphetamine is great. It's good. It's a good state of consciousness. And it could actually, in its good side, it actually can be really wholesome and fantastic, beautiful, insightful, clever, etc. Great. It's just that in our current bodies, it activates a negative feedback mechanism that gives rise to downstream really negative states and very resilient addiction and craving and so on. So and I think Gnostics would probably say something no, the state of the high of a methamphetamine experience is inherently dirty. There's something terrible about kind of being so infatuated with a state like that. Whereas I would say no, it's just the problem is that the ways in which we can get it are just very unskillful, and we just have to figure out alternative ways that are actually sustainable. So maybe in that sense is pretty different.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Definitely. I wanted to come back to that question about stage stuff and levels too, if you have just a little bit longer. Yeah, I was kind of intrigued by, and I'm not sure if I fully understand the association here, so I just wanted to probe that a little bit more, which is, yeah, in that video, you talk about Robert Keegan, you talk about spiral dynamics and Ken Wilber and the metamodernists, and sort of set this up as sort of a developmental kind of lens. And I kind of wanted to explore that more with you a bit. Is the correlation there that what you're talking about in terms of consciousness versus replicators is sort of a level or a complexity stage lens through which you're seeing sort of more clearly the universal plot than, say, less complex, more simplistic versions of good versus evil, a balance of good and evil. Was that the connection, or is there something more that I'm missing between how you're thinking about things in terms of the stage complexity gradient here?
I would say there's a lot of non-trivial connections, and I'm sure we could probably even brainstorm more, but probably the most straightforward one is if you look at kind of the Keegan levels, the progression is something along the lines of, okay, you identify with some aspect of your experience, and you identify the environment as the other. And when you advance to the next level, what you do is you in some sense internalize the environment, and then you identify with the dynamic between what you thought you were and the thing that was the other. And then you identify with that. So it's okay, sure, first you identify with your own, individual selfish desires, and you think of everybody else as different. Oh, then you switch to identifying with the rules of society, and then you internalize that. It's like, okay, then you take that as the object, and you say like, okay, wait, I'm not that. And actually, it's like a lot of different societal rules that are like incompatible and different from one another. So you identify with that dynamic, and now you think of like the thing that you're subjected to might be something else, maybe kind of like ideological dialogue or something like that. And then like, oh my gosh, like you can take that as the object, and you kind of like disidentify with it, and then you identify with the whole dynamic. So there is this kind of like recursive process, and how many layers deep it goes might correlate quite a bit with what is your developmental stage, and is also, I think, very related with essentially detachment from belief that you are a particular form. I mean, like at the most basic level, yeah, if you identify with your body, with your ego, and you cannot disidentify with it, you will be like stuck in a particular developmental stage. Or like if you identify with like an ideology or a political party or something like that, and you truly like you embody that identification, you may just get stuck in there. And in any one of those cases, like a very straightforward solution of like, the Buddhist perspective of if you can perceive it, you're not it. Like if you're perceiving a form, you're not it. Like whatever it may be, you're not that. Like, yes, I think like that is both like metaphysically true, but also is the sort of thing that like accelerates like these developmental stages, and also is the sort of thing that allows you to realize that, yeah, the thing that matters is consciousness, not the particular forms that the consciousness is embodying.
Yeah. And then that it also made me think about how that relates to memes, right? If you do think about the idea of a meme as being an analog, a sort of conceptual analog to a material gene, right? And that memes then thus want to reproduce or replicate themselves. If you are embodying, inhabiting, and identifying with a meme, a cultural meme, a value meme, then you're not you're not the consciousness that is doing the identifying with, right? And so like there's a way in which I think that the different levels of existence can be very meaningfully understood as this sort of extraction or disembedding of consciousness itself from the replication model, really, right? Of like, is that a meaning? Does that make like, is that a good way to apply this sort of way of thinking to what you're talking about?
Yeah. And I mean, a lot of people might associate a lot of kind of like moral feelings to this, um, like yeah, like it's bad, like it's morally bad if you identify with a particular pattern, and it's morally good if you kind of like do this identification. And I mean, in some sense, like I would say it's like better to think of it as like skillful versus unskillful. And it's really not like a moral thing that is going on. At a more fundamental level, it's a physical thing that is going on. I mean, if you look at like the actual practices that allow you to sort of like disidentify with your ego and things like that, you can kind of realize there's an element of like literally kind of reducing the kind of like magnetic charge that your thought forms are bound together into this ego construct. So like, for example, taking cold showers or enduring like hot peppers without flinching and kind of meditating on equanimity and things like that is to kind of just like let that energy flow without like trying to grasp it or trying to shape it into a self-image. And like that is a physical process. I mean, I'm very bullish on thinking that like, yeah, I mean, like our thoughts are in some sense like eddies in the electromagnetic field, and you're wielding them and forging them and annealing them and merging them and all sorts of things like that. And to identify with your ego is actually a physical process. Like you're kind of getting wrapped up into this magnetic current, and you're getting stuck in it in some weird attractor. And to get out of it, it involves essentially a kind of physical transformation, like taking cold showers and saying like, yeah, this is not me, this is not me, this is not me. And you kind of sort of separate from it. And then with that separation, that distance, you can realize like, oh, okay, it has these and these properties. So good that I'm separated from it, because now I don't feel defensive. I don't need to defend that it has these bad things, I can just say, yeah, it actually has these bad things without like feeling attacked.
Yeah. Like the metamodern way of framing development is largely through like the Commons's model of hierarchical complexity, right? And so it's very explicitly tied to complexity. But I think you could make the case really for so many different developmental models, especially when you get into sort of a psychological framing, that this is an axis that unfolds through complexity, really, that it's a different, like, if you're doing these higher level integrations, you're integrating more and more things. And so there's more and more complexity sort of in the mix. And again, yeah. I see that as an exciting part of this narrative that's sort of leading us to, well, as the universe goes through this sort of universal Darwinistic process of evolution at all the levels, biological, but also, like cosmic evolution, all the ways that these things wind up complexifying through time, that you do get a deepening of consciousness that includes the ability for consciousness itself to disembed itself from its more immediate environment and able to kind of identify itself more and more with what that core element is. Which then again kind of paints this a little bit more as sort of a storyline, right? Like an arc. It began here, it's been unfolding through time, and it's leading in a particular place, which, I don't know, for me, aesthetically, I like that a bit more. So there's that lingering element of all this that I kind of want to tease out a little bit of the relationship of complexification through development that leads to this process.
I think you can have like increasing complexity without development, and like you can have like an extremely brilliant savant mathematician who like hasn't even crossed the second Keegan level because it's like very, very like immersed in his world, and like that can totally happen. So like I wouldn't be infatuated with complexity itself, but rather kind of like the developmental process does give rise to higher complexity thinking as a side effect through this process of identification with a particular construct. You embody it for a while, you kind of like get motivated, you identify with it, and then you disidentify and you identify with the dynamic within which it's embedded. Every time you do that, yes, you're adding one layer to your like model of the world in terms of like, nested hierarchies of interactions. So developmental stages lead to complexity, but complexity doesn't lead to developmental stages. So it's hopefully that clarifies a little bit.
There's so many more elements of all this I'd love to dig into more. So maybe we can do this again at some point. And I appreciate you talking, spending the time and doing this. We can pick it up maybe down the line, but
perfect.
All right, cool.
A lot of fun.
All right,
thank you so much for having me.